Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Mexico State University assistant professor Alison Newby was living in Cuba when President Obama ordered the restoration of full diplomatic relations and the opening of an embassy in Havana, thawing a nearly half-century chill between the two countries. Professor Newby is our guest on Fronteras today. Professor Newby, welcome to Fronteras.
Thank you, Edmundo.
Now, you were in Cuba when President Obama ordered the restoration of full diplomatic relations and the opening of an embassy in Cuba. First, what was your reaction? And second, what was the reaction of ordinary Cubans?
There's actually a funny story surrounding that. I had hired someone off the street to repair a mattress for me. And because we were living in a fourth floor apartment, they couldn't bring their equipment up to the apartment, so they were down in the lobby. And I was downstairs talking to them, and another mattress repairer came in and said, oh, they're back. And they were referring to the remaining 3 Cuban prisoners of the Cuban 5 who had been incarcerated in the U.S. And everybody knows when they say they, in that context, what they're talking about. And we're going to have diplomatic relations with the U.S. And I said, no, I don't think so. And the gentleman said, well, that's what everyone on the street is saying. And I said, no, they must be talking about something else. Wouldn't we have known something about this? And then I went upstairs and turned on the TV, and Raul Castro and Obama were giving their simultaneous speeches, and people started calling around. The phone was ringing, Cuban friends, saying, oh my gosh, can you believe this? There were some students from a part of the university that's close to our house, went out into the street and were carrying the flag and were celebrating. I think it was an interesting time because people aren't really sure what to expect, but they're excited. They're excited. It was a surprise for everyone.
So, I mean, this generations of Cubans have grown up not knowing anything other than the Castro administration. Mm-hmm. But there's also, they might be dying out, some people that have known life before Castro. Mm-hmm. And, how do these generations tie together, in terms of how they feel about the news that relations were going to be happening again between the United States and Cuba?
I think that's a really good question. As with anything of this nature, it's a process. Change isn't going to be from one day to the next. And as you say, many people know nothing else. Their lives have been lived without having a diplomatic relationship with the United States. And so I think among some people there is very definitely caution in terms of, well, what exactly does this mean? How do we maintain our sovereignty as a country with this huge, powerful neighbor next door? So I think it's a mix of reactions. I think most people are excited and at the same time saying, well, we want to proceed cautiously.
And you've done work in Cuba for several years. How has the reaction been from the people that you work with, that have worked in Cuba, you know, and that you have a relationship with because of your ties to the work you've done in Cuba, as far as this news go, to how they reacted to it?
Well, many of the people saw this potentially as, you know, tremendous economic opportunity. Several years ago, certain types of private enterprise were legalized by the Cuban government. So we do have people starting businesses, the idea that there will be more tourism, so thus more influx of money going into Cuba, and that's seen as being something positive. At the same time, the idea that, well, there are a lot of things that we would like to come from the United States. We'd like to have more access to certain goods, but there are certain things that we don't want to come from the United States.
And we'll talk about some of those things in a bit. But, you know, one of the things that is interesting is that you have spent 6 months living on the island conducting research on developing private sector.
Mm-hmm.
And you had 2 of your young children who attended school in the country as well.
Yes.
What attracts you to Cuba?
I think, well, that's a complex question. My children are actually half Cuban, so they do have family members on the island, and it's a chance for us to see their family members and for them to have a relationship with them. It's also a place which has taught me a lot as a sociologist about political and economic structures, taught me a lot about the U.S. being in a country that is so different. And it's also, in some ways, a very calm place. You're pretty much off the grid when you're in Cuba, and so that takes a couple of weeks to adjust to. But after that, it's nice not to always have one's computer dinging and the phone ringing, you know, and not to be in such contact with people. And it's a place where there's a lot of humanity. The human relationships are very, very important, and people spend a lot of time on them. And so that's something that I personally really enjoy.
How did your children react? I mean, how did they embrace the culture?
My children had been to Cuba twice before this long experience. Although this time they were in Cuban public school, as you mentioned. And so obviously that was a transition. Once school starts, you know, you are not on vacation. You're just living.
There's no spring break?
Well, we were in the fall, and there was, I believe there was one vacation day in the fall, but after that, you're just, you know, you're living a normal, everyday life. It's not going to the beach every day. And, you know, it's one of those things that, of course, kids have their period of transition into something that's new. But they really enjoy the independence that children have in Cuba. Children are playing in the street during the summer all day long, and then during the school year, after they finish their homework, everybody goes downstairs and maybe they're playing soccer or baseball in the street, walking around. They run errands for their parents. And I think as a child, my kids really enjoy that independence. They say, wow, look what I can do. You know, I'm allowed to go to the store and pick something up for my mom. And I'm allowed to go and visit my friends. It doesn't have to be set up always by the parents. And so that's something that they always mention.
Now, one of the things that I find interesting is that you had the opportunity, there's an opportunity for foreigners to send their kids to a different school, a foreign school, and you decided to send your kids to the public school. Why was that?
Well, there were several reasons. The international school does cost $10,000 a year. And as a university professor, that was yeah, that was a little bit outside my price range for 2 children. Most of the children in the international school are children of diplomats or companies, say, Peugeot, Honda, and then that's, I guess, probably covered by the tuition is probably paid for by the company. Not an option for me. And in talking with my kids as well, they said, well, we want to be with Cuban kids. We just want to be normal. We want to be with the kids in the neighborhood. And I thought, well, that is the Cuban experience. And so that was really what I wanted for them.
On one of your most recent visits, which led you to examine the Cuban government's legalization of certain types of businesses residents can now start and where the funding comes from, how is the Cuban government progressing with free enterprise or limited free enterprise?
Wow, another complex question. So there is a list that was published by the Cuban government and is modified, has been modified several times, of around 200 types of businesses that individuals can start. They also have another type of business opportunity, certain types of cooperatives where it's sort of a private and state-run cooperative system. But in terms of the businesses, well, really one of the main things that makes it difficult is access to capital, because you need to have capital to start a business. You need, even if you're going to be selling pizza from your home, for example, you need to have a working oven. You need to have the necessary pans, all of those types of things. And those can be things that are very difficult to get in Cuba and that are very expensive. So as opposed to the process, the state aspect of the process in starting the business, one of the real barriers is the access to capital in order to do that.
In the times and the years that you've gone back and forth to Cuba, have you seen any changes, in the streets as far as new businesses popping up or any investment happening?
Oh, I've seen tremendous change. Even just in the past 3 years. When I went back this past July, there were businesses on the street where I live that weren't there the year before. And some of these are small businesses catering to Cubans, and others are quite fancy that look as if they were taken out of Miami. And many of those are catering much more to tourists. But you can definitely see the change. I would expect if I go back in 6 months, I'll see another sort of cycling. There will be businesses that will have closed, and then there will be things that will have opened as well.
When many people think of Cuba for many years, first thing that comes to mind for them is Cuban cigars, even sugar, of course, and perhaps rum. What other exports does Cuba have that we in this country will be able to see to benefit from?
I think one of the things that people may have heard of but don't really see it necessarily as an export is Cuban medical professionals. Cuba plays a huge role in world public health. Many of their medical professionals travel around the world doing sort of state-sponsored volunteer work. They were on the front lines in Africa with this most recent health crisis of Ebola. And so I think being able to learn from some of these professionals and have more of an exchange. There are doctors all over the place in Cuba, something that we don't see here in the U.S. You know, there are areas that are underserved in terms of access to medical professionals. So I think that is potentially something that we can benefit from. They're also doing a lot of work in terms of medical technology, despite the fact that they are so cut off. And maybe in a sense because they are cut off, they have worked on developing their own drugs for things because they haven't necessarily had access to things that are produced in the United States. And so I think that that'll be a tremendous advancement for us.
Well, in hearing you describe it, what I'm thinking in my mind is just the economic opportunities for the United States to see what's being developed and to really pick some of that up and bring it to this country. And because I mean, over the years I have heard of the medical research and the medical opportunities that have existed in Cuba, and you hear of the fact that they have free state-sponsored medical care, and it's something of a source of pride for Cuba.
Oh, very, very definitely. There's a joke that Cubans make sometimes that going to the doctor is a national pastime, and it's with this free access, people do go to the doctor when they feel bad, and it's very definitely a source of pride that this is a basic human right that people should have.
It seemed that moments after the big announcement on Cuba was announced that phone lines to travel agencies literally began to light up. How soon before ordinary Americans can travel to Cuba?
You'll have to talk to the State Department and Congress about that.
What would they find in Cuba? I mean, what is the attraction to the island? I mean, I think beautiful beaches, and I think it's the Caribbean. I mean, is that what people are wanting and expecting to see?
I think that may be what a lot of people are expecting to see. I also think for many people, the lure of the prohibited, right, for so many years. So what's it really like there? Is it good or bad? So I think that's something that's attractive for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are interested in all the old cars, of which there are many, and thinking about a place that is so close to the U.S., so Americanized in some ways, and yet so foreign in other ways. People hear, communism, socialism, but what does that really mean? How does that play out in people's daily lives? What do you see? And I think people are very curious about that. And then, of course, the beaches and the cigars and the rum, that's maybe an added bonus for a lot of people.
I had a debate with a good friend of mine many years ago, and 25 years ago, and we talked about going to Cuba. And one of the reasons we wanted to go to Cuba back then was we wanted to go before it became Americanized. Thinking that back then, the change could happen. Is there a possibility for the romanticism of Cuba to disappear once these relations really start to take effect and you start to see more investment and the island starts to look different? Would some of that be lost?
Well, that's something that a lot of people are talking about. Is the famous seawall or Malecon of Havana going to be filled with, McDonald's and Burger King? I think you know, as I said, this is going to be a process. It's going to be a slow process. From a lot of the reading that I've done now since I've returned from Cuba, looking at the U.S. perspective, yes, there's quite a bit of interest in terms of investing in Cuba, but at the same time, it is a poor country. So it's not necessarily a great market in terms of Cubans' disposable income to go to McDonald's and Burger King. So I think a lot of these larger companies will probably be cautious in terms of making their plans. But I do wonder, it's difficult to say what the country will look like in 5 years, because right now you don't see billboards, you know, advertising billboards. There isn't advertising on television. You do not see American chains or products, and it's one of the only places in the world, I think, where you don't see those things.
And I think, you know, again, part of the concern is that, you know, before there was Vegas, there was Cuba, you know, and so there's that romantic Americanized version of what Cuba used to be, and people thinking, wow, what if we could have access to that island again? And again, for the locals, you know, what would it mean for the locals to start seeing that coming in, something that, you know, that is totally foreign, because it's not like they're seeing it on television and saying, geez, here's my MTV and I'm watching MTV. It's something that's not visible to them.
I do think that that people, very definitely people in the Cuban government, are thinking about this. They've talked about proceeding cautiously in terms of the relationship with the United States and making sure that they conserve those values that they consider important, and reestablishing this relationship, but at the same time holding on to those important parts of Cuban identity. And so I think this return to, you know, casinos and pre-revolutionary Cuba, I don't really see that, excuse me, that happening. And right now, the Cuban tourist infrastructure cannot handle a huge influx of Americans. There is some tourist infrastructure, but if they start taking down, you know, several flights a day, they don't have the tourist infrastructure for that.
What's next for you? What are you working on next to, you know, with Cuba?
Oh my gosh. Well, right now I'm still working on compiling all of my notes and writing up the results of my research from the time that I was there. I also became very, very interested in elementary education while I was there, through the process of seeing my children in the Cuban schools and noticing how different the Cuban schools and the structure of schooling was there as compared to here. So I've become very interested in that, and also the development of collective identity, that is, as opposed to sort of a more individualistic approach that we may have in U.S. society towards our lives and our place in U.S. society. Cuban society is very different in that way. And it's talked about in schools with the children, and in terms of assisting children in understanding what their place may be later on in society. So I'm very interested in continuing to look at the private sector, especially with these changes, but also expanding maybe to look some at education.
One of the things I want to talk about before we wrap up the show is the makeup of Cuba, you know, the generations that exist in Cuba. And, you know, I'm curious, I mean, are there a lot of children in Cuba? Teenagers? What does Cuba look like?
Well, from a demographic perspective, Cuba is much more similar to developed countries. That is, the age structure of Cuba, it tends to be older than many Latin American countries. Fertility in Cuba is very low. So when you have low fertility, you have fewer young people. That's certainly not to say that you don't see children. Now, I was living in an urban area, so you have high population density. So you see people of all types. And in the block or the area where we lived, there were, 20, 30 children of different ages. But from a demographic perspective, it's a problem when you have an aging population and you have low fertility. Who's going to be going into the workforce as people are getting older and retiring. So if you think about the country as a whole, this is potentially an issue for them.
Well, Professor Newby, thank you very much for coming into Fronteras at Changing America. And we want to wish you the best of luck, and we look forward to talking to you again to get an update on U.S. relations with Cuba.
Thank you very much, Edmundo. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez.